Jason Smart has been on the No Delusion Zone several times before. I'm really glad to have him back. He is a geopolitical analyst sought after by just about everyone all over the world. He is a Russia expert. He has a PhD in Russian history. He speaks Russian fluently. As I said, he's one of the major geopolitical analysts that discusses the ongoing war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, as well as, of course, related issues with NATO, the EU. And I'm really glad to have him back. He has a terrific YouTube channel, which is just simply at Jason J. Smart. I encourage everyone to go check it out, subscribe, and become a member if you like it. So enough of that. Jason, welcome back to the No Delusion Zone.
David, so good to see you, man.
Same here. It's been a while. And so, like I said, I'm glad to have you back. I would be remiss, which means I'd be a fool, if I didn't at least at the opening ask you at least a brief question, not anything political, but certainly, what's your opinion on the Kremlin's take on what happened at Quantico a couple of days ago? If you're not sure, tell me, but I'm curious since I know that you're plugged into a lot of folks that do get some information out of that fortress. So any takes on what old Vladimir is thinking about what happened?
So I think the key thing to understand about the Russians is this. Their inherent view of the West and the United States is that it's corrupted and it's weak. And due to this corruption, its weakness, it becoming too soft, it will eventually collapse upon itself. It has too many intricacies that contradict each other. And I'll give you an example to that. In this case, what it would argue is that if we just pressure the weak points in the society, for instance, we put more tension in American society where there's racial gaps and we have the different racial groups not get along, that's positive. It's helping to speed up the collapse of America. Or if we see that the military is being divided and not used for military purposes, but used to go after other Americans, they would view that as a positive because ultimately they think that the United States can be tricked, can be fooled. So we get people to become so extreme in their political views, they don't get along, they're totally divided. And eventually the US becomes so internal looking that it won't be paying attention to Russia. And actually Vladimir Lenin wrote about this. His publication was called The Spark. And the spark was the spark of the revolution is what he refers to. But it really doesn't change since then. It's a Hegelian dialectic, which means that simply you create a problem, and I'll give an example. In this case, you create a problem. You say there's crime. As a result, people say, well, we need to be more secure. As a result, then the state is able to step up its monitoring, step up its surveillance, and to send its military into cities because this is something that was demanded by the society. But you can generate that. You can make that perception by, for instance, spreading a lot of news about every crime committed by an illegal immigrant, let's say, which thereby is, because the population reads about this, hears about, they demand more security, and you're the one providing that security. But all this is something that moves the state away from international politics and more domestically politically oriented. But ultimately, it will lead to a state that's become fractured, and a state that's fractured will not be able to stand up to Russia. And Russia, in its view since the 1950s, is that the way to defeat the United States and the West is to create more problems in those countries. As Che Guevara said, lean on the fissures, lean on the inherent cracks in the society so that it finally breaks through. And at that point, of course, today, modern Russia, they don't expect to have a communist revolution, but they do expect that they will create the downfall of society and a new order will rise up, or the country will just become anarchic. And when there's anarchy, Russia can operate as it wishes to.
Yeah, and that's been the main frustrating point to those of us that have worked in counterintelligence that know the history of the Soviet Union, Russia, and the Cold War and the fight of intelligence agencies, knowing exactly what you said, that their main goal has always been to divide us. They've done that in many different kinds of ways, and they seem to be more successful now than ever, not even by their own means, but what we are doing to ourselves. And like I said, that's been, to me at least, and folks that have worked in the field I did, one of the very most destructive elements of the last 10 years, and certainly the last 9 months, 10 months since the current administration has been there. We're destroying ourselves from within. And what happened to Quantico a couple of days ago was, and we're not going to dwell on that, was just a tragedy. That's the only word. I've made podcasts on that. I'll make more, I'm sure. But I just was curious as to what the Kremlin thought about that. And I'm sure they're exactly what you said. They see this as a further divisive element here in America, and that we're doing it to ourselves. So as I said in one of my articles, Putin is laughing. He loves this. He doesn't have to lift a finger. We're doing it to ourselves. So, talking about the failures and fissures within society, you've come out with some podcasts yourself and articles talking about the current collapse, the collapse of Putin. And I'd like you to talk about that. Is in fact the Putin regime collapsing? Is that hyperbole? Because we've been hoping and wishing for that for a very long time. How close are we to Putin being, oh, how shall I say, ushered out of power?
Well, the Putin regime is collapsing, and that verb, I'm very specific. Collapsing is, active. It's currently occurring. It's not future will collapse, and it's not doesn't mean that it's going to occur today either. But it is an ongoing process. We're getting closer. Like bridges are collapsing. It takes time. We see the signs that it's not stable. It will collapse. The specific day we don't know, but if nothing changes, yes, it will collapse. The weight is mounting, and the joists can't hold. But in the case of Russia, I think it is speeding up due to a few factors. One of the chief reasons is obviously economic. The fact that more than 40% of the refining capacity of Russia has been destroyed. Keep in mind, 40 to 45% of Russia's economy depends on oil and gas. So I should say the national budget, not their economy, depends on oil and gas. Right now, due to the lack of gasoline, lack of diesel, they're having shortages across the country, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. And why this is important is when you think about it, it's not just the fact that 70% of Russian military goods are transported by train, of which Russian trains typically use diesel. It's not just that. It's also the fact that for the average consumer, prices go up when there's huge shortages like this. There's no deliveries. And it's not just the person that has a car that has to abandon it on the side of the road because there's no more gasoline at the gas station. It's also because the military cannot transport itself as easily as it could. And in fact, I did a calculation just yesterday that if it's not resolved within 60 days, Crimea becomes very open to being attacked by Ukraine. The fact is that the Russians do not have enough diesel there and they can't physically transport enough there quickly enough to keep the garrisons with the diesel they would need for their motorized divisions, for instance. So looking ahead, what this all means. Putin himself is doing a lot of things recently that are strange. Things that, as a person who studies Putin, having followed the guy for 20 years, and yeah, my master's and doctoral dissertations were specifically about the Putin regime. He's doing things that he's never done before. Things that show that he's a little bit worried. He's being more chaotic than he's ever been. Saying things that, for instance, he was at a forums where they ask him a question about choose an issue, about why you should invest in Russia. And he goes off on these tangents about needing to support the war and the war has to continue. Why is he really doing that? The general conclusion that I think a lot of people come to that study Russia is that he's trying to signal to others in the Kremlin that there's no hope that this war is going to end. This war is definitely going to have to be prosecuted to the end. But that puts him in jeopardy because those around him realize the war can't be won. They just finished a summer offensive, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and what do they have to show for it? Less than 1% of Ukrainian territory was taken, empty farmland in eastern Ukraine. This is not a success. They didn't take one city, not even town. They took villages that have been totally obliterated. There's nothing left. So if that's what it looks like, the Russians realize, well, this is eventually going to end badly for us. It's not a question of if, but when. And if he's not willing to make the moves necessary, then that's probably going to accelerate the decline and fall of his regime. Keep in mind also, the FSB, the intelligence service of Russia, has arrested 17 generals in the past few years. That's really uncommon. UK, US, Germany, France combined have arrested 0 in the past few years. The fact that there's 17 of them being arrested within Russia, that's interesting. But what's even more interesting, 15 of those 17 were ones that work in logistics. Going after the guys that work in logistics is strange. Why is that? Because they're in charge of contracts and things like that as well, buying things, purchases. The FSB is trying to take that over to make money. But the downside of that is that today there's shortages in the military. They're trying to take it over for their own selfish reasons, but people that sign those contracts now across the military don't sign anything. They don't want to sign anything because they're going, I'm about to be investigated probably. If I make any purchases, it's going to work out badly for me. Doing nothing is the best thing I can do. All these things are contributing to a heightened fear in the flag officer class of the military, and that's going to further jeopardize and hurt the Russian ability to continue waging war.
In the West, and I'll say specifically here, at least in the United States, and we talked off air a little bit about how the American public, for the most part, are not the most, how shall we say, informed people in the world. They happen to think, at least a large percentage of them do, that Russia's winning the war. And a lot of that comes from Russian disinformation that's passed along through channels here in America. But the fact of the matter is, and I'll let you elaborate on this, Russia is not winning the war. If they were, we wouldn't be speaking right now because the war is over 3.5 years old. And they still haven't gone beyond, I think, 19 or 20% of Russian territory in all that time. And they're losing an average of 1,000 Russian soldiers, either killed or wounded, every day. You just did a podcast recently on one of the areas where they've been bogged down in the near the city of or village of Pavlovsk. If you want to talk about that, and at least the podcast, and just in general what that signifies, I think that would be very interesting.
So, yeah, the Russians aren't making a lot of progress. To put it differently, since 2022, Russia controls less territory in Ukraine than it did then. But it also controls less territory inside of Russia than it did in 2022 because Ukraine still occupies little parts of Russia. So ultimately, Russia in no sense is winning. In the past 3 years, when they started to retake territory, they have lost over 1,100,000 soldiers and they have gained less than 3% of the territory of Ukraine. By no means can we consider this to be success. The casualty rate per operation is in the area of about 80, 85%. That's unsustainable. I mean, in the US military, if you're an officer and you go into something and you end up losing 20%, your career is pretty much over. The fact that for them it's 80 or 85% and you're not replaced, you're just kept there to keep sending them in. And it's done in such a sloppy manner. And Chuck Farr, my friend and my colleague at Kiev Post, Chuck was a former Navy SEAL platoon leader, Navy SEAL Team 6, great guy, lots of experience, was an officer and did fascinating things. But he was pointing out to me, I said, why are they doing this? Why do they keep sending these men in who are just going to be obliterated every single day? They're like, you'll look at the battlefield and you'll see that, or the path they have to take to try to engage the Ukrainians, and it's littered with bodies, littered with motorcycles, and you're just every day sending them through there. If you know they're all going to get destroyed by drones, why keep doing it? And he said, presumably what's really happening is they just are told every day, 3 times, you have to make an attempt on the enemy positions. And so at 10 a.m., at 12 and at 2, they'll make an attempt on the enemy positions. And every time it works out exactly the same. They're not being rewarded or encouraged to do anything to break the mold, just to follow orders. And that's also a means of controlling the military, to take away any sort of autonomy that they have or any sort of agency that they have and just be, yep, I checked off the boxes. I did what my boss told me. And that's all they want from their military. But you can't win a war if you do that.
No, and the reason that it's been going on so long, and to be pessimistic, Jason, I think you'll agree with me, the reason it will go on longer if nothing changes is because that's the way Russia always fights wars. It's very centralized. The lower ranking officers and non-commissioned officers have absolutely no say. If they say, like you just stated, which I'm sure, as you said, Chuck was right, they're told 3 times a day at certain hours, you're going to advance, you're going to charge and attack the Ukrainian positions. Period. That's it. And nobody disputes that. They may not like it, and you'll have a lot of deserters, which they do, but that's what they'll do. And they will sustain all the insane casualties that would make any Western army just stop because they'd be called combat ineffective if they lost, like you said, about 20%. But it's not going to stop unless things change. And the reason the Russian people haven't risen up, and you can talk about that if you want, is because they're primarily getting these conscripts from the Far East in Russia, the poorer communities. They are intentionally not drafting or taking people from the larger cities, especially Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Well, absolutely the case. I mean, one of the things is that the Russians, incredibly enough, the Russians, one of the reasons that their historic plan of how you win a war, which is attrition, you're absolutely right, is that, they have a much larger population. It's about 140 million people. It's much larger than any neighboring country, which means that if they were to engage a foreign country, they can then just, grind down that country. They're just going to always have more men. So they can afford to lose huge numbers, but in the end, they'll win because simply there's more of them. Now, that doesn't really work in the modern warfare, though, because we have things such as drones, which is destroying them before they're even able to engage the Ukrainians, or HIMARS. When they start to muster and we see a big group of them together, they all disappear simultaneously. And so all of a sudden, this theory of warfare doesn't work out when you can destroy your enemy from afar. You can't overrun them anymore because you're not going to engage them. You're being destroyed from far away. And that's where their theory is sort of falling apart. But the Russian people themselves, it would appear that they're increasingly sensitive about this war. They're not in love with it. They don't really want it to continue because even statistics coming out of Russia, which, by the way, there's no statistics that are independent in Russia. Let's be clear about that. So if it's coming out, the Kremlin wants it to come out. And for whatever reason, the population would be willing to settle for a peace of some sort is definitely increased dramatically. But I think that's because a lot of people, one, never really cared about this. They never really wanted to get engaged in this. They don't really get it. But also, they aren't directly affected by it in Moscow and St. Petersburg, as you alluded to. They've definitely taken a well disproportionate number of soldiers from places in the Far East, such as Buryatia, which is ethnically well, they're Buddhist, but ethnically they're Asian. You look at people from Dagestan or Chechnya, they're Muslims minorities. But these sorts of minorities going off to die, the average Russian doesn't feel any compassion or any interest really what happens to them, which leads to a different question, which is that Russia presumably, well, realistically, it engages like a colonial power. It's sending off the colonial troops first, those that are the occupied territories of that Russia occupies, I should say, such as the Chechens or Dagestanis or Buratyas. They all came into the Russian Empire, what, 150 years ago. They are, Russian citizens, but they're not ethnic Russians. And so the Russians like, well, you get to go off first. If we're going to lose some lives, it's not going to be the white guys in St. Petersburg. It's going to be those guys. And so it's sort of sick, but I think truly ethnic cleansing on the part of the Russians, where they're trying to clean up their own society, in their view, of these different ethnic groups, which they don't view to be truly Russian.
Well, and they've done a very good job there. And I'm sorry, you know Russia better than I do, but I've been there quite a lot, and I speak to people there all the time. They're racist. I mean, they look down at these other cultures, even within their own country. So it's not that they're, like you said, there's no love lost for the most part of those conscripts that are being sent from the indigenous populations. And I wasn't really going to talk about this, but I want to just divert a little bit. I speak to some folks that are part of organizations that are preparing for the possibility in the future when Putin is gone and maybe some kind of a more democratic Russia exists, at least in the far future. And they are working towards trying to work with the indigenous populations and that were formerly, like you said, about 150 years ago or 100 years ago, independent. Do you see any post-Putin Russia having any sort of I don't even know what you want to call it, any of these formerly independent nations making a run on becoming independent again?
So, um, and I also know a lot of guys who work on that topic, and it's a very interesting topic. But here's sort of where it's a bummer, is a lot of the ones, for instance, if you were to look at it, Central Russia is where the oil and gas are. Now, oil and gas is, as I said, central to Russia. Without oil and gas, what do they really have? John McCain was absolutely right. They are a mafia that owns a gas station that has nukes. That's about all they are. But at the same time, the problem is that that is the only thing that has value. So if that's the only thing that has value, and there happens to be a local ethnic group that lives in that region, you're an oligarch. Do you really care about them? Or would you just wipe them all out if you had to make sure that you keep the billions of dollars a year? Trust me, they'll definitely kill whoever they have to make sure that they control them. The idea of Russia today, and I think David Satter, who's the most brilliant by far person writing about Russia in the past 20 years, David was the Financial Times bureau chief in Moscow for many years. He was one that first exposed the crimes, the Kremlin, the Putin regime. But either way, one of the things that he always comes back to is the very uh, utilitarian, I mean, a very atheistic viewpoint of humanity that a person has no intrinsic value. If you have no intrinsic value, it's like a styrofoam cup. So today, if I use a styrofoam cup, I throw it away when I'm done with it. But if I don't need it at all and it's surplus, I just destroy it because who cares? It's just a cup. The people are the same way. They're there for today. But if tomorrow I realize these Baratyas, there's too many of them, they're causing problems, just kill them off. I mean, send them off to a war, get rid of them because we don't really need them. Like, why would they have value? Just because you're a citizen of our country doesn't mean you have value. That's a very important thing that we have to understand. It's different. For instance, on the battlefield, we see that the Russians routinely abandon their wounded soldiers or they kill them themselves because, okay, well, we used him, he charged, and now he's laying here wounded, but I just finish him off. And that's common with the Russians, and that's their entire worldview is very much aligned with that.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes hesitate to say that, and paint any culture with a broad brush, but you're absolutely right. Again, anybody that's spent any time in Russia and has close contacts in Russia knows that what you said is true, that for the most part, at least with a large percentage of the population, they value life differently than we do in the West, I think, and this is just my personal opinion, because they've never had a great future to look forward to. It's always been pretty bleak, which is my personal opinion, why Russians never smile. Whole other conversation, maybe a podcast, but they don't. And they're always incredulous that we do. And when I first heard that, I said, maybe it's because in America we have something to smile about. Did you ever think about that? And they did, and they said, "Yeah, but we don't," and they don't for the most part. So that's another issue. But and it's too bad. I think you're right. I don't see a future in the near future, even if Putin goes away and somebody else comes in, and they are quasi-democratic, of the formerly independent nations within Russia becoming independent again for the very reasons that you said. I want to talk about drones. Drones is an inescapable part of what's going on in Ukraine. Some of it's very negative because of the advances Russia has made, but it's overshadowed, in my opinion, by the incredible advances that the Ukrainians have made. Talk about that just a little bit. You mentioned it about how they're absolutely crushing the Russian oil refineries and supply lines and logistical areas. Why? Let me ask you this. I just read recently where the situation in Crimea is so severe, the shortage, that they are now drastically reducing the rationing for gasoline among everyone in Crimea. And like you said, it's opening it up to a Ukrainian attack.
No, it's definitely open up to Ukraine attack. I mean, Crimea is, a peninsula, so it's got the bridge, it's got ferries, it's got the airports, and it's got radar that protects them. So if you look at Ukraine the past couple months, I've kept an eye on this. Ukraine has blown up a lot of radar inside of Crimea. So, and you're a military guy, you get this, is any sort of strategy, any sort of plan is going to be not just today something happens. People always say, why don't they blow up the bridge? Well, you'll blow up the bridge when it gets closer. Right now, there's other things that have to be done. Go after the radar, go after the air defense, and once you whittle that down, then you go for the airports. Why? Well, once you get rid of the airports, then you blow up the bridge because then there's no way at all to get there. And that's when you make a move. But you don't blow it up until all the scene is set. And you have to have your side ready, your side's ready to take action thereafter after the scene's been set. To go after the ferries or the ports there. That can all be done on the same day. And Ukraine, if you look at the attacks on that bridge, the Kerch Bridge, Chuck Farr, again, I'll cite him because he was the Navy SEAL that did underwater demolition, which I am not experienced in, but he is that he said, if you look at where they've attacked over the past few months or a couple of years, it's different parts of the bridge, not the same part. And that's important because that means it's overall structural weakening. Because if it's just one part, you can fix that one part. But when overall, you lose 10% here, 10% here, 10% here, 10% here, it becomes a lot more problematic for the Russians. And I think that the Russians now are in a position that any day, yes, Ukraine could decide to totally go full out. And the things that Zelensky has said recently were very positive, much more so than usual. And he's definitely signaling something's going down. And even Donald Trump, for that matter, the fact that he said that Ukraine can win back its territories, that's after he met with Zelensky. So he received some sort of information from Zelensky. There is something definitely going down on the Ukrainian side, and it's a positive thing. The Russian side, they're losing territory. They lost 7 villages last week. Ukraine is taking back more and more territory. And at this point, due to the fact that they can't transport soldiers, the fact that people are not willing to sign off on logistics, they're not willing to sign off on purchasing more materials for them, that is all stuff that is weakening Russia's ability to wage war.
This is not a drone, but I'm excited about the developments on the Ukrainian side of the Flamingo.
Mhm.
How familiar are you with that? And can you talk a little bit about the Ukrainian Flamingo?
So the Flamingo is Ukraine's first drone of this type. Well, in fact, it's a ballistic missile
Yes.
because of the way it flies and how it's powered, etc. But what's interesting about it is that it is because domestic production. The beginning of next year, it'll go into mass production because it can go over 1,000, was it 1,200 kilometers, which is about 700 miles. That means that it has the ability to go really deep inside of Russia. Now, Russia doesn't have the ability to stop, if there's a lot of these coming in at the same time, to stop them. And that's important because it's more than just targeting soldiers. It's not like HIMARS to just take out a group or a regiment that's standing there preparing to attack Ukraine. It's about going after things such as the oil refineries or the factories that produce the chemicals that are needed to refine the oil or to create gunpowder or whatever sort of chemicals these are. You would never think about it, but just quite logically, there's choke points across any economy, but in Russia, especially because it's Soviet organized, where one factory and only one factory makes X chemical. But X chemical might be very critical for a number of different things. So if that chemical factory gets destroyed, you've stopped production of weapons, you've stopped the production of, silicon, you've stopped the production. Choose what's going on. Tons of things are going to be stopped. That's really important, and Ukraine is doing that clearly. So if they go after these sorts of nodes, these sorts of factories, which are largely located in the western part of Russia, fortunately, which is the part closest to Ukraine, that means that Ukraine's going to have the real capacity to keep destroying these things. Russia at present cannot continue this war. The fuel situation is far worse than what many people appreciate. I don't know how to stress enough. Just imagine you're a Russian citizen, all right? You're living your town, and all of a sudden you see they're closing the airports down due to the fact that Ukrainian drones are flying over them. You see that you can't get gasoline to go anywhere because they're just out and they can't promise you more. You can only buy eight gallons of gasoline at a time now. They also have the fact that I'm trying to think, it was 8 gallons or 8 liters. It must be gallons.
Leaders.
8 gallons. Sorry, I was just trying to do the reverse math. 8 gallons. And then they also have the fact that they've reduced and some places just don't have any, so you can't get any. But that's the maximum you can buy. But going ahead, the prices are just getting out of control. Inflation is extremely high. About half of Russians are seeking a second job because inflation is so high, their current job doesn't pay them enough. That's with an unemployment rate of 2.2%. It seems really good when you think 2.2%, but it's not. You should not have that low of unemployment. That's actually an indication of high inflation, and it's getting much worse. Now with these attacks on the fuel industry, it is going to change Russia's capacity to wage war. All these things are boding in Ukraine's favor.
I just want to say one last thing about the flamingo and move on to just a couple of last things. Not only does it vastly increase the range, like you said, that Ukraine can target, but my understanding is it increases the payload up to 8 or 10 times what any drone can carry. So, as you said, it could take out a refinery, not just damage it and have it go back online in one day or even a couple of weeks. It could just take it out. The same thing with logistics centers, command and control centers. I mean, these are ballistic missiles, if you will, or drones on steroids. I don't know if you want to call it a game changer, but it very well could change the trajectory of the war.
Oh, most certainly the case. And what's fascinating about that is that, I mean, once again, things I never thought about before this war. But if you're going to attack a refinery, think about this strategically. You don't want to attack the part that's Soviet, though that might make a very beautiful, huge explosion. You want to go after the part that has the most foreign parts possible, because that they can't readily replace. So if you blow up that part, the one that's the intake or whatever it happens to be, or whatever aspect, if you blow that up, they can't fix it. There's nothing. I mean, they'll probably violate sanctions, but that'll take years. I mean, months or years to fix. So you want to go after the critical parts that they cannot easily replace. Going after, as I said, those parts of the oil refineries or the factories that produce chemicals. You go after things that Russia cannot readily replace. And Ukraine is effectively doing this. It's leveraging very few weapons, very few flamingos to have a well larger impact than Russia's having with all of its attacks every single day on Ukraine.
I think I'll end it with this last question because I think the drone warfare is probably the most important advancement that's happened in this war and right now. And I think in the future it's tipped towards Ukraine. Is there any reason to believe that the drones that have been spotted in over Denmark and then have closed down their airports for several days now are not of Russian origin?
Well, the French already stopped the oil tanker, which they believe was the one from which they came. Now, what's interesting about that, though, so it raises a totally different question, is if we know they came from an oil tanker and it's one of the shadow fleet, one of these illegal ships floating around the world that's transporting Russian oil against the sanctions of Europe, against the sanctions of the United States, why did it have to come to the ship being used to attack a NATO country before it was stopped? If we know where they are, we know that they're engaging in sanction violations, why are we not interdicting the ships right now? I mean, interdiction is not that complicated. We have the capacity 1,000 times over to do so. And keep in mind, by international law, we can. Not only are they violating sanctions, they are not seaworthy. They're not following the environmental standards. Their crews are not trained. They do not meet international seaworthiness. And if that's the case, we have the obligation, not just the right, the obligation to stop them before there's an environmental disaster. We could have an Exxon Valdez tomorrow, easily, because their ships are in such disrepair. So the fact that we're not going after them is something that is hurting our interest. It's not just about Ukraine. This is hurting our interest, and we should be stopping them. But going ahead with the drones like they did, we should expect a lot more attacks like this. They're definitely going to be attacking Europe routinely with drones. That is coming. That is definitely coming. And unfortunately, we see that Europe is not yet very well prepared for that. And unfortunately, many people in Europe continue, like Orban, continue to pretend like, oh, this is just about Russia and Ukraine. It's not. We all know it's not about Russia and Ukraine. Russia's real objective is not Ukraine. That is an important battle for Vladimir Putin. But this is a global war in his viewpoint. And that global war is against the West. Ukraine is simply a proxy of the larger war that he's waging.
They talked about erecting a drone wall. That's been the new catchphrase over the last week or two, actually, since the drones over Poland, Germany, Denmark. But that's not supposed to be even operational for up to 1 year. As I've said and you've said many, many times, NATO is responding to all of these attacks, these transgressions, these infiltrations, very, very, very slowly, too slowly. Some of the leaders get it. A lot don't. I don't know what's going to happen there. I really don't. They're still playing around with whether or not they're going to release the 150 odd million or billion euros that are in the bank in Belgium to give to Ukraine to support the war effort that's been going on for years. That's insane. Jason, we're going to have to leave it there. We can talk about this for hours. We're going to have you back again to do that. So I just want to thank you, Jason Smart, who has his channel again on YouTube at Jason J Smart. Please go there, take a look. He's got, I think it's 500 podcasts up there now. Take a look, subscribe, become a member. I think you will not regret doing so. Jason, thanks a lot. You take care, and let's do this again soon.
Great seeing you as always.